So this is topic 3.3, discount securities. And before we launch into a discussion of discount securities and what they are, let's just remind ourselves of the following. We've got short-term debt markets and long-term debt markets. These sorts of markets exist in every developed country in the world, and they're very, very important for borrowing and lending money. With this timeline here, it's not really a timeline, but I'll call it that. I've got different durations of lending and borrowing. So I've got short-term lending and borrowing, short-term lending and borrowing on the left, longer-term lending and borrowing on the right. Now, these short-term debt securities, they're typically called treasury notes if they're issued by the government when the government wants to borrow money. They're called bank bills if they're issued by banks when banks want to borrow money. And they are called commercial paper when issued by companies when companies want to borrow money. So what we're talking about here, discount securities, I've got three examples of what a discount security is here. And just remember, they are the financial instrument that is used to lay out the terms and conditions of a loan, that is, facilitate a loan in these short-term debt markets. So let's get on to these discount securities. So I'm assuming that a lot of this I'll let you read yourself, but I'm assuming that we're dealing with a bank bill. So a bank bill is sold by a bank when it wants to borrow money. A bank bill is sold by a bank when it is demanding loanable funds. And so I'm considering a bank bill with a face value of $100,000 and a term to maturity of 120 days. So this is a very short period of time. Now let's just imagine that it was you and me borrowing and lending money. If I was to borrow money from you for, say, 120 days, would you want interest payments on the way through? Would you want interest? 120 days, that's effectively 4 months. Would you want interest payments on the way through? Or would you be happy simply earning your return on the loan at the end of that 120 days? I'd be happy with earning my return after the 120 days. I wouldn't need interest payments every, say, 30 days. And I've labelled it here day 30, day 90, not to indicate that there's anything happening at day 30 or day 90. I'm just using those numbers to label the 120-day period. So personally, I wouldn't need interest payments. I'd be happy if you just paid me my return on the loan if I was lending money to you at the end of the 120 days. Compare that with owning shares in a company in Australia. Most companies will pay dividends to their shareholders every 6 months. So very often if you hold a share, you don't get a dividend for 6 months. So it's a little bit unusual you wanting interest payments every month, if that's what you were thinking previously. It's a little bit, nothing wrong with that, but it's a little bit unusual. So the way this market works is that the return is paid, the return on this loan is paid at day 120. But these discount securities operate a little bit unusually, a little bit differently than what you would possibly expect. If the discount security has a face value of $100, then at day 120 over here on the right, it's redeemed at its face value for $100. That means at the end of the loan, the borrower pays the lender $100,000, the face value of the bank bill. But to build a return into this loan, when the bank bill is sold at day one, it's purchased at a discount to the face value, hence the term discounted securities or discount securities. So I'm making up numbers here. Let's just assume that at day one, the security is sold for $98,500. So as a lender of money in this market, when you buy the bank bill, you're going to hand over $98,500 and then get back $100 120 days later. So your return, your outlay is $98,500. Your return is $1,500. So your rate of return is $1,500 divided by $98,500. You could calculate that as an interest rate, and then you could annualize it. And we've spoken about that previously. You could annualize it to get the annualized equivalent interest rate. And remember, the interest rates we'll be seeing in this course are annualized equivalent interest rates. Okay, so the market does determine the purchase price of $98,500. So that price is going to be dependent upon the demand for loanable funds in this market. That is, how many banks are in this market wanting to borrow money, and then also the supply of loanable funds. That is, how many lenders are in this market willing to lend money. And you could imagine how this price would be determined by the forces of demand and supply. You could draw a demand and supply curve of bank bills in this case. And if there was an increase in the demand for bank bills, it would mean that the price of bank bills goes up and the return or the interest rate would fall. So if there was an increase in the demand for bank bills, the price goes up. But why would people be demanding bank bills? Well, those people would be lenders wanting to lend their money. And so if you've got more demand for bank bills, that means you must have more lenders of loanable funds. If you've got more loanable funds being offered to this market, the interest rate's going to fall. So hopefully you can reconcile those two ways of looking at this market. One is the demand and supply curves of bank bills. The other is the demand and supply curve of loanable funds. And you can look at this market either way. They are equally valid, and they'll give you the same answer in a sense. If you're trying to determine what the bank bill rate is, sorry, what the yield in this market is, the interest rate in this market, you could use the demand supply curves of loanable funds. If you wanted to determine the market price of bank bills, in this case, we've assumed it's $98,500, you could use the demand and supply curve of bank bills themselves. Now, I'll challenge you to do the following. Draw a demand and supply curve for bank bills, and then have the demand curve for bank bills shifting to the right. Of course, you're then going to get a higher price of bank bills, but then challenge yourself to draw, using a demand and supply curve of loanable funds, exactly the same event that I just described. More people demanding bank bills. How is that going to affect the market for loanable funds? So with bank bill prices going up, that must mean yields in loanable funds markets must be going down. So how are you going to get in the market for loanable funds, and you should be thinking demand and supply of loanable funds with the yield on the vertical axis, how are you going to get that yield falling? Well, there's only two ways you can do it. You either decrease the demand of loanable funds or increase the supply. So which is it? It's actually an increase in the supply of loanable funds in that example I gave you. So if we have more people wanting to buy bank bills, that is consistent with a rightward shift in the demand curve for bank bills, but it's also consistent with a rightward shift in the supply of loanable funds. So that's quite important. It's quite important to understand that the price of bank bills and the yield on bank bills is inversely related. Okay, so that's how these discount securities work. And whether you're talking about treasury notes, bank bills, or commercial paper, they're all discount securities and they all operate in basically the same way. Okay, so let's revisit this idea of an inverse relationship between bank bill prices and yields on bank bills. So I've got a lot of text there. First of all, discount securities can sell in the primary market for these securities, the primary bank bill market, for example, or the primary treasury note market, and they can also sell in a second-hand market, that is the secondary market. So if you have purchased a bank bill, which means you are lending money to a particular organisation, and you don't want to hold that bank bill anymore, you want your money back, in effect, you can actually sell it in a secondary market, just like you can a share of a company. And that person that buys the bank bill off you might pay you the same $98,500, or it could be a different price. But that's the way that you then could get your money back, having loaned it out to the bank or the government or a company in the first place. You can sell your bank bill in the treasury market. You can sell it a day after you've purchased it. Remember, purchasing a bank bill means you are lending money. And so you can sell that bank bill and get your money back the day after you've purchased it, the day after you loaned the money. And so these primary and secondary markets, they're quite active. In the case of a bank, it will, if it wants to issue bank bills, remember, it wants to borrow money. And if it wants to issue bank bills, it will go into the primary market and sell those, because they'll be new bank bills issued by the bank itself. And these interest rates, they are changing every day. And when we get to some data and we have a look at some interest rates on these sorts of discount securities, you'll see that they do vary every day. And I'll show you a data source on the Reserve Bank's website where you can actually see day by day these interest rates changing. Well, they change minute by minute. Well, actually second by second. They're that liquid. It's that liquid a market. So these interest rates are constantly changing every minute, every hour, every day. So how does the market change interest rates on discount securities? So let's consider now the same bank bill. Oh, actually, I've now changed it to 90 days. I had 120 days here. I've now changed it for some reason to 90. There's no good reason for that. But we've changed it with face value. It's still got the same face value of $100,000. And it sells in the primary market on January 1st for $98,500. Because it was being sold in the primary market, it must have been the bank that sold the bank bill. The return is $1,500 divided by the market price of the bond, which is 1.52% for 90 days. Now, let's fast forward a month. It's now February 1. And the scenario that I'm creating, the picture I'm painting, is that investors are now nervous about domestic macroeconomic conditions. Investors are lenders in this sense. Okay, not borrowers. They are lenders. They are the people the people supplying loanable funds. And those investors have become nervous about domestic macroeconomic conditions in Australia. In fact, everything that I've been talking about here, I was thinking in my own mind, Australian bank bills, Australian discount securities. I was thinking about Australia here, but equivalently, all developed countries have short-term debt markets like this. So I'm saying that because I'm assuming that investors, both domestic and international investors, that is domestic and international lenders, are now nervous about macroeconomic conditions in Australia. Doesn't matter what's made them nervous. It could be the talk of a recession. It could be a jump in the inflation rate. It could be a jump in the unemployment rate. It could be a sudden fall in stock prices. It could be a collapse in housing prices. It could be a range of different things. But for some reason, they are nervous about macroeconomic conditions. Something negative has happened in the Australian economy. So as a result, they start moving money out, investors start moving money out of the stock market and into the safety of debt markets. Okay, that may not be immediately obvious to you. Actually, the way I've framed this example with investors, I was talking about suppliers of loanable funds as well as investors in the stock market. So I'll broaden that definition of investors now to both lenders, people that are buying discount securities, and people that are buying stocks. So all investors. Very often, a sophisticated investor will buy both stocks and some of these discount securities to diversify the risk of their portfolio. But we don't have to focus on that too much. Well, we don't have to focus on that at all. Anyway, something's happening. Domestic macroeconomic conditions have worsened and people start moving their money out of the stock market and into the safety of debt markets. Why out of the stock market? It's because the downside risk in terms of stock prices could be quite large. Stock prices, depending upon the stocks you buy, stock prices can easily, in response to adverse macroeconomic shocks, fall 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50%. After the GFC, the share prices of Australian banks fell from memory by about 50%. And so if you were holding those shares, you would have lost 50% of your money. Now, you could argue that the share prices came back up. Yes, they did. But you really, if you were a sophisticated investor, you would have got out of that market early when banks' share prices were still quite high, taken the money, waited for them to fall, bought in at a much lower price, and then enjoyed the capital appreciation. So yeah, sure. I guess that's the difference between yeah, as I said, sort of a more sophisticated investor and someone who doesn't know what they're doing. I could say a lot more about that, but I'm just holding back. I'm not going to. Okay, so stock prices during negative macroeconomic shocks can drop substantially. And so if you move your money into the safety of debt markets, what does that mean? Well, it means that even though stock prices can halve in value, and if a company fails, the stock price can go to zero. Even though that sort of loss is possible in the stock market, in debt markets, it's not. Because if you're purchasing a discount security for, say, $98,500, then in 90 days, you're guaranteed to get $100,000 back from the borrower. And the only way you wouldn't get your money back is if the borrower collapsed. So if it was a company that went under. Now, if it was the government, for example, and you were buying a treasury note, so you're taking your money out of the risky stock market and buying treasury notes, then the only way you wouldn't get $100,000 back at the end of the 90 days is if the government of Australia collapsed and they ran out of money. Well, how's that going to happen? Sure, some governments have got into trouble, and that issue is more sophisticated than what I've just indicated, and we'll go through that later in the course. But just for now, accept that it's unlikely that a government will completely fail. And so therefore, if you're buying treasury notes, you're likely to get your money back. Okay, and I'll qualify that statement as we move through the various issues facing the global economy later on in the course. Okay, so on February 1, people start moving their money out of stock markets, maybe even out of other risky asset markets, and into the relative safety of debt markets. Debt markets are safe because the face value of these debt instruments, they don't fall. And so the only potential loss you face is if the borrower completely goes out of business. So they're safer than stocks. And so some of this money moves into bank bills. Now, as that money moves into the bank bill market, it's going to increase the supply of loanable funds. That means there'll be more investors demanding bank bills in the secondary market. And so if you've got more investors who have taken their money out of risky markets, now demanding bank bills, it's going to push the price of bank bills up. And I'm assuming that the price as a result of this macroeconomic shock, the price of bank bills now increases to $99,000. The return is now $1,000. You've paid $99,000, you'll get $100,000 back. So the return is $1,000 divided by $99,000, which is 1.01% for 90 days. So the market can actually adjust interest rates by changing the purchase price of these discount securities. If the market wants interest rates to fall, it can bid up the price of these securities. If the market wants these interest rates to rise, it can push down the price of these securities. So once again, we've got this inverse relationship between the price of these securities and the yield that those securities pay to lenders. It's exactly what I've got down here. Okay, now just one final point before I finish this particular video. The example that I did use was money moving out of stock markets and into debt markets. So it was actually investors pushing the price up, which then had a flow-on effect of reducing interest rates from 1.52% to 1.01%. That's the example that I gave in this slide. So that was prices driving a decline in interest rates. Now that can happen. But other times it works the other way around, where the market may want to push this interest rate down, and it does that by raising the market price of these securities. Okay, so I'll say that quickly again. Sometimes in the real world, in these financial markets, you get a circumstance where, or a situation where investors want to push more money into this market, which means prices go up, which then leads to interest rates falling. So the direction of causality of this inverse relationship is from prices to yields. Prices, in this case, go up, yields go down, or prices could go down and yields could go up. But causality is from the price of the security to the yield. Now, in an event like this, a macroeconomic shock like this, that would be the direction of causality. However, in other situations, in these markets in the real world, the market doesn't change or doesn't want to change the price of the security. They actually want to adjust the interest rate. So the market wants to push the interest rate up. In this case, it's the interest rate which goes up, which then it's the desire for the interest rate to go up, which then pushes the market price of the bank bills down. So in this different situation, you've got the desire to push interest rates up, causing prices to fall, or the other way around. The desire for interest rates in these markets to fall, pushing the price of bank bills up. Okay, so that's subtle, and hopefully it makes a little bit of sense, but all you need to know at the moment is what these discount securities are, that they are used by a range of different large organizations to borrow money over short periods of time. You need to understand what a discount security is, but probably most importantly, you do need to understand that there is an inverse relationship between the price of these securities, whether we're talking about the primary market or the secondary, doesn't really matter. There's an inverse relationship between the price of these securities and the yield. And you need to be able to sort of talk your way through how that inverse relationship comes about in the case of discount securities. Okay, and the final thing that I mentioned is sometimes prices change first, which then adjust yields, and then other times yields are required to change, which then forces prices to adjust. And just keep that in mind, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by causality running sometimes from price to yields and sometimes from yields to price. I'll explain what I mean in the rest of this topic.